Good evening. Is everybody here okay? My name is Mark Kounick. I'm the mayor of the Village of Cary. Before we get started with tonight's events, we have some village personnel here I'd like to call out. We have Trustee Ellen McAlpine back here, Trustee Jim Kostler, Trustee Jennifer Weinhammer. We also have our chairman of our ZPA, Patrick Corey, is here with us as well. And our brand spanking new village administrator, Jacob Reif. We just appointed our village administrator last night, so we're thrilled. We also have another visitor here, a distinguished neighboring village president, Bob Nunemaker, is here with us tonight too. I think that we're going to need some more chairs. Okay, we have a couple of seats up here. Okay, there's plenty of seats if you want to fill in. So I won't take up any more of your time, but I'd like to thank Senator Dan McConchie for coming out tonight. It's very important for us. He's a big supporter of the Village of Cary. He helps us all the way. His staff has always been very great to us. And without further ado, Dan.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mayor Kounick, for that. I just want to draw my attention to the lady in the back who's in pink. That's Deb Fates. If you ever call my district office, she'll be the one who answers the phone and is always willing to and able to help you out if you have any issues with state government and things like that. So first of all, I just want to thank those of you. Oh, yes, thank you. I just want to thank you for coming out on this beautiful night. We were just over at Cruise Night, and we announced that this was going on, and I told people, I don't know why you would leave that to come over here and hear about the state of Illinois. But I am thrilled that there's so many of you that care about what's going on in our state and want to learn more. We have more people coming down the stairs, and we've got, if we can, they've got 2 chairs up here in the front. We got 2 right here. If you don't mind just filling in. All right. Well, so what I want to do is start off by telling a story. And it's not just kind of my story, but it's really kind of the story of our district and what is kind of happened down in Springfield over the past year. So to give a little bit of a perspective. Is this microphone working okay? All right, okay. So I came into office just about a year ago, and when I got down to Springfield, we were right in the thick of the legislation that was going on during the session. Now, at that point in time, we were about 10 months in to having not had a regular budget. Okay, so that's a very long time. When we first, our fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th, and the very idea that we would go without a budget even a few weeks was shocking to some people. The fact that we went 10 months was really unheard of, and so there was a lot of jockeying back and forth to try to get a budget done. And let's see, we got 2 seats right up here if you like, if you don't want to have to stand in the back the whole time. More chairs, all right, we got more chairs coming. Yeah, more people coming down the stairs, great. So so I got in about mid-April, and constitutionally, by midnight on May 31st, that is the end of the regular legislative session. Now, what does that mean? Now, there's really 3 numbers that you need to know, need to understand about the way Springfield works. 60, 30, and 1. Okay? In the regular session, to get any piece of legislation passed into law, you need 60 members of the House, 30 members of the Senate, and the governor to sign off on that. Okay? After you pass midnight on the 31st of May, then you go into what's called overtime. And then you have a 3/5 majority instead of just a simple majority that's required in order to be able to pass legislation. So there was a lot of work to try to get a budget done right there toward the end. And it's interesting, in the past, if you've looked historically, it's interesting, but what has typically been the case is that Speaker Madigan, who controls the House, has often passed a budget adjourned the House and left town for Memorial Day weekend. Sent a budget over to the Senate that without the ability, without giving them the time to amend that budget in any way, shape, or form, so that they could either pass it or don't pass it. And so historically, over the years, they would pass that budget and send it on to the governor for his signature. And so on the Friday before Memorial Day this last year, that's exactly what Speaker Madigan did. He passed a budget that spent $7 billion more than we have coming in, sent that over the House, sent that over the Senate, adjourned the House, and went home for the weekend. So I'm sitting there, and because I'm part of the Republican caucus, we would have meetings, and we would be sitting around, frankly, for hours not doing much, because the Democratic caucus was meeting amongst themselves to talk about this scenario, that once again, the Speaker had passed this budget that had no input from them, that overspent by $7 billion, and then left town to give them absolutely no ability to change anything, just give a yes or no. That was it. So we go to the day after Memorial Day. This is the 31st. And sometimes, how many of you in here played football? All right, so those of you who play football will understand. When you're kind of in the thick of things that are going on, you know, you have a job to do and you're working on that job, and sometimes you don't know that the ball just went 30 yards down the field, right? You know, because you're so concentrated on your job. And sometimes you can get so close in the legislature that's happening that you're unable to kind of know kind of what the big picture is that's happening. So I'm sitting on the floor, and there was, I'm checking Twitter, actually, to try to keep up with what's going on. And the news starts reporting, this is early afternoon, that President Cullerton had said he was not bringing the Madigan budget up for a vote. And this was really unprecedented. I mean, it was shocking that we were actually going to end the year without trying to pass any sort of budget at all. First time in history that anybody knew of. So about 5 hours later, I'm sitting on the floor, and the budget comes up on the board for debate and a vote. And I turned around to Senator Pam Altoff, who's the senator just north of us here. And if you've been around Cary for a long time, I know she's represented this area in the past before redistricting. I turned around to Pam and I said, "What's going on?" And Pam said, "I don't know." She said, "We were told the budget was not being brought up for a vote." So the debate happens. And remember what I said, 60-31, right? You needed 30 votes in the Senate to be able to pass this budget, to send it on to the governor that he can either sign, veto, a mandatory veto, line item veto, reduction veto. There's various different things that he could have done with the budget. So there were 39 members of the Democratic Party in the Senate. So they only needed 30 of them to pass the budget. They put the bill up on the board. The Madigan budget got 17 votes. Now, this was really indicated a real change of direction for the Senate, and Senate Democrats in particular, because what they had said for the first time that many of us had known of was that they were rejecting essentially being Madigan's lapdog. They were saying, no, we are an equal partner, we're an equal branch of government with the House. You can't just sit this on our lap and tell us to, just do your bidding. And so we ended the session without a budget. So fast forward a month, end of June last year, I'm actually on vacation with my family down in Tennessee, visiting my new nephew and my brother. And I get a phone call, "We're going to be voting on a budget. We need you back up here in Springfield." So pack up my family and kids, drive straight through to Springfield. Fortunately, I had a suit in the car, and my kids had some clothes. We got to take them onto the floor. We get onto the floor, and what was being proposed at the last minute was a 6-month stopgap budget, okay? We were not given information, any significant information about what was in it. There was backroom negotiations that were going on. We were not really told what was there. Under Senate rules, we had an hour posting notice. So I think it was like 2,500 pages or something crazy like that. And so we have an hour posting notice. There's no way of being able to know what's inside. This is on June 30th. And so we pass out this stopgap budget that funded schools for the whole year, that funded roads and bridges, or infrastructure for the whole year, and then everything else on a 6-month basis. Only later did we find out that that budget spent about $7 billion more than we had coming in. It was continuing the same kind of problem that we had. So this spring, so in December, after the election, a lot of people said, okay, well, after the election, we're going to see what happens, and maybe we'll be able to get a budget after that. After Madigan and Rauner have had their proxy war versus, in the state legislative seats, perhaps we'll be able to get a budget at that point. And so in early December, it became clear that was not the plan. It was not the plan of the speaker to allow any sort of budget to come up for a vote. Now, some people have, and I've actually got an email this week, somebody said, why don't you get back down there to Springfield and pass a budget, get around the table, negotiate and pass a budget. To which I wrote the nice lady back and I said, I would love to do that. If it were up to me, there would have been a budget a year ago, but it isn't up to me. Okay, I am one of 177 members of the legislature, and despite the fact that we are a democracy, inside the legislative chamber, okay, in the House and the Senate, we are one of the most autocratic, one of the most top-heavy, controlled by the Speaker and by the President of any state in the country. As an individual member, the only thing that I am able to do is introduce a bill. I'm only able to speak up and debate a bill when it comes forward, and then vote on a bill. That is it. I have no control over whether a bill comes out of what's called assignments and gets sent to a committee. I have no control over whether there's a hearing on that bill. I have no control over if it's brought up on the floor, even if it passes committee, and even if and when any of that takes place. All of that is controlled by the Speaker and the President. So after it became clear back in December that there was not going to be a budget, that the governor and the speaker were not going to be coming to terms, my leader Christine Radogno, and President Cullerton decided, let's be the big people in the room. Let's sit down and let's negotiate a deal amongst ourselves. Let's show that we can, Republicans and Democrats, come together and put together a budget. And so there was negotiations went on for about a month. And there was the initial outline. There was some issues that came on. Negotiations began going on, and they drug on and on and on and on and on, to the point that we still, it wasn't until about 3 weeks ago that we actually passed many of those pieces of legislation out of the Senate, sent it over to the House, and what happened? Absolutely nothing. Right, Speaker continues to sit on those pieces of legislation. In fact, when at the end of May, Speaker Madigan did not even offer a budget of his own. For the first time in history that anyone can remember, nobody remembers that time in which the Speaker did not even offer a budget of his own to pass out of his own chamber. And so here's where we are at this point. We have the Speaker who refuses to pass a budget out of the House. We have the Senate who's passed a budget, and I'll get to some of the details about what that is, and sent it over to the House, and the Speaker has said no. We have the governor who has been continuing to negotiate, has been negotiating not simply on a budget, he's been negotiating on a broader agenda, what he recalls a turnaround agenda or reform agenda. I happen to think that there are a lot of aspects to it that are important for us to have in Illinois. The fact that it was tied to a budget was a tactic. It was his tactic. He decided to do that. But a lot of people want to say, well, what do we look like? Where are we right now? And what does it look like? So if you can turn your attention to the screens, let me just paint a little bit of a picture as to where we are in Illinois. Okay? So first of all, this is a picture. I'm going to put my glasses on. So I can actually read what it is that you've got. So these are the manufacturing jobs that have been created here in the Midwest since 2009. So a lot of people have said, well, we just need a budget. We just need to solve the problem. We have more systemic problems than that. It's only been the last 2 years that we've not had a budget. So since 2009, Michigan has added 150,000 manufacturing jobs, Indiana 83,000, Ohio 76,000, Wisconsin 41,000. We've lost 1,600 jobs. Okay, these are our jobs that are moving out of our state, largely to our neighboring states, because of things like property taxes, out of control. How many people like your property tax bill? I didn't think any. Nobody raised their hand. All right.
I got a cheap one.
Workers' compensation. I know of one company in the South Loop just moved over to Indiana. They saved $1 million alone, but just in workers' comp insurance by moving across the border. And that doesn't count all the other ancillary taxation costs and regulatory costs that they saved. We have, as I just mentioned, workers' comp is a big issue. We have the 8th highest workers' compensation costs in the United States. This is a big cost on business. Now, virtually nobody in here probably knows what workers' compensation issues are, or had maybe thought that you would care. If businesses have moved out of the state, this is one big reason as to why. Property taxes, okay? We have the 2nd highest property taxes in the nation. And here's the rates by comparison to our neighboring states. So if you just move across the border to Wisconsin, which we've had companies do, we had Uline move across the border. We had Amazon decide to set up their big shipping warehouse right across the border in Pleasant Prairie. There are others that are moving across the border. Property taxes is, in workman's comp, 2 big issues as to why those companies are moving. On property taxes, if you have a house that's valued at $179,000, which probably nobody around here has that, but you will pay up $2,545 more a year on your property taxes than you do in Indiana, okay? This would feed a family of 4 for 10 weeks, okay? You won't be able to read this, but this is what's called Tax Freedom Day. There's a nonpartisan organization called the Tax Foundation, and what they do is they just study tax policy across the state. If you look at Illinois, we are 44th out of 50 when it comes to what's called tax freedom. And this counts for federal, state, and the local tax burden as to what is the date in which you kind of quote unquote stop working for the government. We are a full week behind the national average, and there's only 6 states that are behind us that actually have a greater tax burden than we do. So our spending spree, this is how much our spending has increased since 1995. Now, you sure, unless you're in the very front row, you can't read these numbers, but we start off in 1995, and our budget was right about $15 billion a year, okay? So if you look at where we are now, we're spending right about $38 billion a year, okay? You can see that there's a number of years in which that red line exceeds the blue line. These are years in which we were dramatically outspending our income. And then you can see this drop-off in income that happened in 2016. That was when the temporary income tax increase expired, went back down from 5% to 3.75%. So it dropped back down. You notice that our expenditures, though, look at the last year. We're currently spending $6 billion a year more than we have coming in. $6 billion. Now, people want to know, well, where does that money go? Okay? So here's the 5 areas, 5 agencies where most of the money goes. So on the left, that blue piece of the pie is higher education. I can't even read numbers. At 1.9 billion. State Board of Education, that's funding for our schools. That's in the bottom there. That's, somebody read those for me. I can't. That's 6 billion. Healthcare Family Services, Medicaid, $7 billion. Department of Human Services, this is our social service agencies and things like that, it's $3 billion. Department of Corrections, there on the left, that's our prisons and such, $1.2 billion. And then there's about 95 other state agencies that consume about $4.3 billion. But where does the money come from? Okay, so the big red portion on that is our income tax. Half of our income comes from income tax to the state. Sales tax is about 22%. Your utility taxes and things that you pay on cable, satellite, cable TV and things like that, 3%. The casinos, casinos have been actually floated. We actually passed a gaming bill out of the Senate that's supposed to help solve our ills, would add 5 new casinos to the state. You can see that we only get 1% of our budget from casinos. 2% comes from the lottery. Medicaid match, that's the federal money that comes in. So when we, someone comes in on Medicaid, we pay for something, they give 50 cents on the dollar, the feds give it back to us. So about 12%. Cigarette tax, I didn't realize, but there's still enough people out there smoking to get us $355 million a year doing that. And then there's some other miscellaneous things, about that's about 8% of the budget. So our bill backlog, I actually had someone come up to me at the cruise night and say, hey, I'd like to talk about healthcare. I work for Advocate Hospital, and the problem that we're having is the state isn't paying its Medicaid bills. No, that's absolutely the case. If you look at our bill backlog, this is started in 2005. This is now over $14 billion, okay? These are the unpaid bills that are sitting on the comptroller's desk right now. So that accounts for about $1,100 for every man, woman, and child in the state. Every single one of us, about $1,100 worth is how much our portion of that is. Pensions. I talked to somebody who was a teacher, part of the pension system. Anybody else who is a state employee or a teacher, okay? You get a pension. Now, let me first disabuse people of a notion that they have that we just need to stop giving out pensions and that this would save all our budget problems. Now, there has been a lot of overpromising that was done with our pensions. I am the first to admit that. There was a lot of underfunding that has happened over the years to our pension systems. But especially for teachers, the pension system, if we fund it adequately, is actually a really good deal, both for teachers and for taxpayers. And let me explain why. Because teachers do not qualify for Social Security. Okay, so when they are employed, they do not pay into Social Security, and the state does not pay that matching portion into Social Security. We pay it instead into the pension fund. And unfortunately, over time, you can't skip payments to Social Security, right? Federal government will. There's no way. You cannot do that. But we have taken pension holidays of our own and created this mess. So what was a good deal for teachers and a good deal for taxpayers, because actually we were saving money and giving better benefits to these state employees, we were taking payment holidays on. Now, there are certain categories of state employees in which, frankly, I think should not get pensions. Legislators are one of those. First thing that I did when I got to Springfield was to opt out of the legislator pension and to opt out of the health care plan. Let me give you an idea, thank you. Let me give you an idea of how generous that plan is, okay? That plan, if Speaker Madigan was to resign today, he would make $130,000 a year out of the pension. Plus, he would have guaranteed health care for life, okay? So, and then there's groups of state employees who actually get Social Security and get a pension on top of that. It's not like the teachers, okay? So there are certain aspects of state employees in which the pension system is not a good benefit. For taxpayers, it's a really good benefit for those on the other side. And let me just give you one statistic. For example, for every dollar that we budget for someone's salary who's a state employee, not teachers, for a state employee who gets Social Security and pension, we budget 54 cents for their benefits, for health care costs, I'm sorry, no, that's not right. It's 54 cents just in pension costs, plus $24,000 a year for health insurance coverage. So you almost double. For every dollar you pay your average state employee, it's almost double. The benefit is almost $1 as well. And so over the years, we did not fund this. So you can see the increase in this. We are now at over $129 billion in unfunded pension liabilities in the state. That amounts to about $10,000 for every man, woman, and child. So I mentioned that there was this negotiation that was going on but in the Senate. That negotiation broke down during the process. The governor got involved. Both sides, I think, were accused the other side of moving goalposts and so forth. And so Senate Democrats decided, we're just going to pass a budget on our own. So they passed a budget which only had a minimal amount of cuts to it and raised taxes by $5.4 billion, okay? This would have taken this would take your income tax rate from 3.75% to 4.99%, because God forbid we go back to 5%. It would have expanded the number of things that get sales tax, so pest control, landscaping, actually large segments of groups that do services that don't have strong lobbies in Springfield. Somehow they were the ones that got a sales tax applied to them. Lawyers, accountants, and others who do have very strong lobbies in Springfield somehow got exempted. So $5.4 billion in a tax hike. So I actually decided during this process that, nobody was talking about, I was hearing from constituents, but nobody was talking about what does it look like to live within our means? Why are you coming back and or why are legislators saying, and so many people in the public saying, we just need to have a tax increase? And so I decided to go out and say, well, certainly it's possible to live within our means. Let's look what it would look like to do that. And so we passed, me and Senator Kyle McCarter put out a budget called the taxpayer bargain, in contrast to the grand bargain that was being negotiated. And so we balanced the budget with no new taxes, and we exempted primary and secondary education, Medicaid, pension payments, and it's not listed on here, but also debt service. We exempted all of those things. So we were taking care of our most vulnerable, we were taking care of education, we were cutting on everything else. So what did we cut? We cut state agencies and departments by 10% across the board. We shifted responsibility for pensions to local schools over time and immediately to universities. We asked local government to cut spending by 4% of overall budget. And we asked universities to cut spending by 5% of overall budget. By doing this, this got us really close to a constitutionally balanced budget that would not require any sort of tax increases. So this is where we are today. We laid out a marker. Here's what it looks like to balance your budget. It is possible. It's painful to do, but it is possible to do it. Here's what it would look like to balance a budget with no cuts. We have the Senate Democrat passed plan, which would minimal cuts, raise taxes by $5.4 billion. And let me just say, this would balance the budget. They were seeking to balance the budget under current programs. Let me tell you that in the first 5 months of this year, we passed through the Senate $1.8 billion of new annual spending, new programs that sound great on paper for a lot of people. It would be pay raises for certain groups of people or new programs for poor children in inner cities and so forth. That was on top of, this was not included in the budget plan that was passed by the Democrats. Now I want to talk briefly about education funding, and then I want to go to your questions, because education funding, you may have heard, okay, I'm going to ask the opposite question. How many people are upset about their property tax bill? All right, there we go. Now we got some participation. So one of the big issues, the reason, if you look at your property tax bill, the reason why it is so large by percentage, it's not because of what the municipalities. It has very little to do with your park district and your library board and the other entities. It has to do with the fact that the vast majority of that check that you write twice a year goes to the schools, and the reason why is because we fund education at the lowest level from the state of any state in the country. Okay, we're 50 out of 50 when it comes to state support for education, which means that our schools then have to come to the local property taxpayer to be able to pay this. Now, property taxes are really problematic for a number of reasons. One is they are not directly reflective of your ability to pay. They're a carrying cost based on the perceived value of the house that you have. Now, how many people in here are retired? And your income is now significantly less than what it was, all right? Significantly less than what it was when you bought your house, right? You're probably living in a house that if you were to go out and buy a house today, based on the savings that you have, the income you have, you probably wouldn't buy a house of that size or that cost or so forth, right? So I have a lady who lives in my district. She's in Fremont Township, which is in the rural area just north of Mundelein. And she talked to me and she said, look, she said, I'm a widow. I live on Social Security only. That's all that we have. I make $14,000 a year off of Social Security. And I cannot afford to stay in my own home. I just want to live out my days in the little 3-bedroom ranch home that my dead husband raised our children in. Her property tax bill is $10,000 a year. So she tries to live. She's continuing to try to live in her house because this has just been her dream to want to live out her days there. And what does she do? She goes to the township and gets help, assistance with groceries. She's on food stamps. Okay, the problem with property taxes is they are not directly reflective of your ability to pay. Whether other types of taxation, income taxation, your sales tax, and so forth, are actually based on how much money goes through your hands, right? The more money you make, the more income tax you pay. The more that you spend, the more sales tax that you spend, right? It's actually based on your economic activity, which is why most states have moved away, except for us in New Jersey, moved away from property tax in the form that we fund things now. So there was a school funding reform commission that the governor put together last year. I was one of 25 members of that commission. And on that, we were tasked to try to come up with a new school funding formula. And what it would do is say, as we put new money from the state into this, as we've recognized, you know, our state constitution says that we should be spending, like, a majority of the money that's spent on education should come from the state. We're at 26%. That's all the, you know, of the total bill that goes to pay education state, we only pay 26% from the state level. So we were trying to come up with a new, more equitable funding formula so that kids who live on, well, you know, no matter where they live in the state, they get a good education where they're ready for college and career. Okay, they actually, doesn't matter what your zip code is, you can go to school and get a good education. And that was the task that we were given by the governor and the plan that we came up with. And we came up with what I thought was a good plan. It's based on 27 elements from that are based on research on what it should cost to educate a child in a state, in a particular district, given the makeup, given how much available resources there are, what's the concentration of poverty and things of this nature. So after the commission was done, we came up with our report on the 1st of February. We then started trying to craft that report into legislation. And so here's a little bit of a picture. So right now, there is a lot of inequity in the state, and here's one good picture for it. So on the left, Apple, you can see that, I can't read these numbers again. So 30%, so for Chicago public schools, okay, 55% of the money comes from locals, 30% from the state, 15% from federal. Next to it, Cary School District 26, 83.7%. comes from the locals, 12.2% from the state, and only 4.1% from federal, okay?
Doesn't Chicago contribute something that the other?
I will get to that. I will address, yeah, and I will address that issue. So, so this is school funding kind of in general across the state. The left is state average. On the average, localities will spend about, 64% of the money comes from locals, 25% from the state, 7.7% from federal, and then you see the numbers on the national average. So we're at 67% for local funding. National average is 44%, with 46% of the money nationally coming from state resources. Now, there was a bill, Senate Bill 1, that passed that started with the work that we had done on the commission, but then turned around and, I'll say, bastardized the process by changing a lot of the inputs and manipulating the numbers to actually drive a lot more money toward Chicago public schools. And this is an example of poor districts across the state. So the top one, Cairo, which is a very far south town, they have their school district, 99.2% of the students in their district are low income. They would get $145 per student. That's it, under this new school funding formula. So you go down, right under it, East St. Louis, very poor area, 98.8% low income, $237 per student. These are other examples. You go to the very bottom. Chicago Public Schools has 83.9% low-income students, yet they would get $1,333 per student. This bill was crafted as a bailout for Chicago. Right now, Chicago is going to have to borrow $900 million because of how poorly they're managed just to finish the school year that's ending right now. They got to borrow $1 billion to just finish the work that they've started, okay? This was geared to funnel on an ongoing basis, $500 million a year into Chicago public schools. And here's an example. So this bill would have put $705 million in new funding, and you'll see on the left one, 70% of the money would go to CPS, and 30% would go to other districts across the state. Yet they only have 20% of the total students in the state, and certainly not the poorest by any means in many areas across the state. Some people have asked, well, why is that? I mean, other than the fact that Chicago's just, trying to get more money, are they that badly mismanaged? In part, yes. I think they have 1,100 employees that make six figures. They have gamed the system in such a way that their property tax rolls, half of their property tax rolls are in what's called a TIF district, which cannot be taxed by the local school district. So they've taken half of all of the loot is not even on the tax rolls. They collect taxes on it, but the money goes back to the developers to help, underwrite the work that they did to build the buildings in the first place. They keep them in TIF. So what happens is they artificially deflate the amount of money they can claim to be able to raise at the local level. Plus, their rate is about half of what ours is in our area here. If you have an equally priced house here in Cary versus in Chicago, they will pay right about half what you pay in taxes. So they've gamed this system, and then they've used their power in the legislature because of their size and the number of members down there to get more and more money funneled from the state, which you and I are paying in sales and income tax and other taxes to get funneled back there. Now, I want to be able to take your questions. Now, just one request that I will have up front is, please don't ask me about President Trump. Please don't ask me about the Affordable Care Act. Please don't ask me about pulling out of the Paris Accords. I really do not answer questions about things I have no ability to vote on or any sort of power over. But anything that has to do with what's going on at this, and you know what, don't ask me about whether or not the Cary mayor is doing a good job or not. I'm not going to answer that question either. I let you guys be the judge of that. So we want to talk about state issues. Yes, sir.
That committee you were talking about with the 20 people, were they all Republicans or was it four?
No, so it was both chambers. So there was 5 members from Democrats in the House, 5 members from Democrats in the Senate, 5 Republican members in the House, 5 Republican members in the Senate, and then the governor had some appointees that included Reverend James Meeks, who is a former Democrat. He's a former Democratic senator who's now head of the State Board of Education, and some other experts. One of them is the head of Human Services. Yes.
One comment: in Chicago, when I was going to be a teacher, the reason Chicago teachers getting more money because it was hazard pay.
So you had a question a minute ago in regards to whether or not Chicago has paid something on their own, if I understood your question right, that others have not. So let me just explain briefly. So I don't know if it's 30 years ago or something like that. Chicago asked to opt out of the state-run pension system, the TRS, this teacher retirement system, and run their own pensions. So we did that. We stopped doing that, and in exchange, we gave them a block grant of $250 million a year. Commonly referred to as the Chicago Block Grant. So they were essentially getting money from the state for what it was, but they wanted to manage their own pension system. And what have they done? They've underfunded their pension system by billions of dollars, and now are in such a hole that they're now coming back to the state and asking for parity in order to be able to essentially be bailed out because of how poorly that they've managed their system. So under this plan, and part of the reason that there was so much money that was being put into there, that $494 million, that would have put all of us on the hook for the existing teacher Chicago pension system, as well as allowed them to maintain the block grant that they had been getting for years and years and years, as well as drive more money on a per student basis to them by the way they had manipulated the formula.
So
Yes.
there's 2.1 million students and seats in Illinois. Florida has 2.7 million. We have 865 school districts versus there's 67.
Sure.
Isn't the real issue in Illinois, we are just have too many pieces of government. We have 7,000 pieces of government.
Yeah.
The only state second to us is Texas with 5,000.
Right.
Isn't this the real issue here?
That is a huge issue. Now, one of the things that I will state is that we absolutely have way too many school districts in this state. Every school district that you have, you end up, I think average superintendent salary is $2.25 $225,000 a year for each. So the state of Massachusetts has 14 districts for the entire state. There's a lot of states that will do an entire district by county. There's a couple of things that stand in the way of school district consolidation. One of them is the fact that we actually tax, through our property taxes, the rates are different for elementary and high school districts than they are for unit districts. If you take the elementary district and the high school district and add those percentages together, because if you're in, what was it, Cary District 26, that's an elementary district, right?
Yeah.
So if you look on your bill, you've got a line item for that, and then you have a line item for, was it 155? Okay, so you'll have two different line items. If you add those together, those districts are actually getting more money than if they were a unit district. On a just the percentage is higher. So there is no incentive on behalf of the school districts themselves to consolidate in that way because they would be giving up money. Okay. Another thing another big obstacle is you have to get school boards to be willing to vote to consolidate. Okay. And there's 2 or 3 hurdles here. I'll mention really 3. So one of which is you will have a superintendent who will fight like the devil to keep their job, right? Because if you have 2 districts and they merge, one of those jobs goes away, somebody's out of work, and they don't want to be out of work, right? And they will fight like the devil to keep their job. But bigger than that, whenever you have 2 districts merge, almost inevitably, those districts have different tax rates and they have different salary schedules. Now, this is something where I take strong issue with the public sector, with teachers' unions. Hopefully, no offense to anyone in here. But I ran a bill this year that would allow, because right now, if 2 districts merge, those 2 salary schedules have to be immediately put into one. And the union always fights for whatever the higher wage is. So if you have 2 districts and you've got a teacher in one, a 3rd grade teacher, she's making $68,000 a year, and a 3rd grade teacher in the district next door, and she's making $58,000. Well, who are you going to? Are you going to tell the one teacher she has to take a pay cut, right? Well, no. They say, okay, well, we're going to raise the salary levels of everybody in the poorer district to the upper one. So consolidation this way, in an immediate fashion, the unions won't let it happen unless all of those salaries from the lower district get bumped up to the higher one. And then you have 2 different tax rates in the 2 different ones, and so the district that's paying lower taxes almost inevitably gets their taxes bumped up to the higher rate of the other district, rather than there being a cut of some sort. So I ran a bill this year that would have simply allowed for there to be 2 different salaries. With 2 districts merge, there could be 2 salary schedules that would go forward until the next scheduled negotiation. Okay, so if they've each got a contract and it's for 3 years, they could go for 3 years under the existing salary schedules to provide a ramp for them to be able to try to consolidate services and things like that, try to get some money savings so that they could afford the next salary negotiation to be able to pay for those bumps up. The union came up to me and said, absolutely not. There's no way that we will ever support the allowance of 2 salary schedules in one district, because we feel that it would be unfair for the one 3rd grade teacher to make more money than the other 3rd grade teacher in the same district, even if they just recently merged. And I said, let me get this straight. I said, so the superintendents, the school board members actually have told me this is an issue. If we could solve this issue, this would give them the ability of being able to merge. Without this, they refuse to merge. Okay, they just say we can't afford to do it. So you're telling me that you're telling your members who are in the poorer district, sorry, you're stuck in the poorer district. You're not going to get a salary raise under any circumstances. Under this plan, at least, you could incentivize consolidation, and perhaps in a 3-year period, they then get bumped up. They get brought along. There's a path for the teachers that are making less to actually make more. And the guy looked at me and goes, well, we're still going to oppose your bill. I mean, this is the kind of thinking that it is so insular down there. And so let me just talk a minute, if you don't mind, about public sector unions. We are now entirely surrounded by right-to-work states. Now, I personally differentiate between public and private sector unions. At least in a private sector union, you've got the management who and you've got the workers, and essentially they're debating over how much the profit. How do you split up the profit, right? In public sector unions, there is not that counterbalance on the one hand, right? You have taxpayers whom the other side can use the law to essentially vacuum as much money as they are able to get out through the elected representatives that they are funding, right? The senator who's in the district next door to me, the teachers union give him 50 grand every year, $50,000. So a teacher pays into the union turns around and gives the money to those members who will then maintain the status quo by using the power of the state to keep it that way. So this is the problem with public sector unions, and why even some of the original founders of unions over 100 years ago said this should never apply to the public sector, because you have the power of the law to be able to force money out that doesn't exist in a private business, right? We have the profit, we know how much is there, let's come to an agreement on how we divvy that up. So let me tell you, this proposal to raise income taxes to 4.99%, that was a compromise on behalf of some of the members on the other side of the aisle. Some of them would like to see, there was a lot of them who thought 5.25% that should actually be. I've heard as much as 6.5% and 7%, okay? From numbers. I mean, this is where you get a few members who are then able to force, if you will, people just to then open up their pocketbooks or move out of state. Yes?
So I had a question regarding the part where you said that you were willing to protect in your bill the taxpayer bargain, the Medicaid, for the most vulnerable. So can you walk me through what that looks like? Because at this point in time, as an early intervention provider, the state is almost 90 days delinquent in payment. So what I'm looking for is a proposal that fully funds programs like early intervention, because we get the match out from the federal government.
Is that through Medicaid, or that's a separate program than Medicaid? It's through Medicaid, okay.
We are paid currently, like it was a court order consent decree. There's how many of those throughout the state right now?
Right.
With the Memsovsky case, which was the Medicaid. However, payments are not timely, and so we need an appropriation in a bill that pays your early intervention providers.
And I appreciate the work that you do and the service you do. Let me just say that if we did an appropriation, it wouldn't change one thing for you. We have appropriations that are out there right now, and those bills are not being paid because we have $14 billion in unpaid bills sitting on the comptroller's desk that there is no money to pay. So under the proposal that I put forward, not only was there not any tax increases, but there was also, we did bonding in order to help pay down the backlog of bills to get within at least 120 days, hopefully 90 days, so that then these bills would be getting paid for in an ongoing fashion. Let me just tell you something. If we had a balanced budget tomorrow and there was no bonding of any sort, then you would not be paid. There has to be a bonding component. You know, talk has been around borrowing probably $7 billion that would then pay down back. Now that's terrible policy. Let me just be perfectly frank. It's terrible policy to go and borrow money to then pay down your current bills. But this is the situation that we're in, right? The speaker has been in office longer than I've been alive, right? And I've got some gray hair here. You know, let me just say something very interesting. So last week, maybe it was the week before, the speaker actually sat down and did a half-an-hour-long interview with WGN. And he, you know, blamed the governor for an inability to come to a budget, and said he thought that, you know, any sort of reforms that the governor wanted to do need to be completely off the table, and maybe we take them up someday. We absolutely have to have a budget. And so at the end of the interview, the lady said, so Speaker Madigan, you've been in office for 45 years. You've been speaker now for 31 years. When you finish your term, you will have been the longest serving speaker in United States history. What is your legacy? And he said, well, my legacy is that I'm married to a nice lady, I have 4 kids, and I have grandchildren. And she goes, well, okay, but you've been in office this long. What is the legacy for the state? And it says, well, the governor is ruining the middle class. That's And that's something that I want to stop here in the state. Let me tell you that the speaker has zero interest in anybody in this room, in any issue in this room. It doesn't matter how good early childhood education is. It doesn't matter how important the University of Illinois and its research park is. It doesn't matter whether or not people are dying on the roadways because we aren't actually paving the roads in the timely fashion that we ought to. None of that matters to him. All that matters to him is that he hangs on for power yet through another term.
So how soon before we're on a collision course with bankruptcy?
Well, okay, so bankruptcy, we are not allowed by U.S. law to go bankrupt. The only way we could go bankrupt is to actually have Congress pass a law that would allow it. Now, there has been questions raised as to whether or not our pension systems could go bankrupt. My guess is no. My guess is that if somebody went into federal court, I mean, this goes back to our unfunded pension liability. I mean, one of our biggest line items is how much we pay in pensions and the legacy costs into pensions. My guess is that if somebody went into court and tried to file for bankruptcy on behalf of the pension systems, again, that biggest line item, to try to get it cut or reduced or do something with it, is that a federal judge would say, by extension, even though these are separate institutions, that by extension, the state is a guarantor of this and has the full faith and credit. So where we're at now is that our bonding level now is one notch above junk level. That got dropped the day after the end of session, so June 1st. They promptly dropped our credit rating, which means going out and borrowing money is even more expensive. We have been told that if we end the fiscal year, which ends at the end of this month, without a budget, we will actually be put into junk status, which will make borrowing next to impossible. I mean, we are very close, actually, to
He doesn't care, does he?
No, he doesn't care.
So if we can't go bankrupt and we don't have enough revenue coming in and the debt keeps skyrocketing, what's the solution?
So I sat down a few weeks ago with a businessman who is now retired. Lives in the city, and he used to be in charge of a big utility here in the state. And when he came in, the utility does a lot of work in the city of Chicago. And when he came into his position, he said, we were having a very difficult time maintaining services, especially in the city. And Mayor Daley was fit to be tied because, you know, what happens if your utilities don't go on? Well, yeah, I mean, we probably all call either ComEd or NICOR or, you know, whoever the company is. In the city, they call 311 and they call the mayor's office and say, you know, why is my electricity not working? Why is my water not on? And so Mayor Daley was very concerned about getting the utilities back on track. So he said, it took me a few months to realize that Mayor Daley actually knew more about my operation and what was wrong with our operation than even my own senior vice presidents did. Finally, I just went to the mayor and just had him help me get everything up to speed. He said, we figured out what a solution to the problem was, and he said, what we needed to do was we had a number of things we need to do, but part of that, we needed to pass a bill through the legislature to be able to allow us to get some of the changes that we needed to make. And he said, despite the fact we were doing this hand in hand with Mayor Daley, you know, the son of the great, you know, Mayor Daley. He said, Speaker Madigan held us out there for 2 years. And he said, at the end of the 2 years, we finally got a bill through. And he said, that bill, the numbers in it, I couldn't believe. He said, the numbers were better than I ever thought we would get out of the legislature. And he said, what I figured out was at the end of the day, Speaker Madigan didn't care about the numbers. What he cared about was being able to prove to us and prove to the mayor that he could hold us out there for 2 years and essentially be able to demonstrate his own power. Now, one of the things that has been said is that when the speaker, when our governor first got elected, he sat down with Speaker Madigan and he said, look, I'm interested in working together with you. And one of the things the speaker did was hand him a list of all the mayors, all the governors that he had served kind of under their tenure. And the message was, I will outlast you too. So the question really, there are possibilities. I mean, there's a lot of cuts we can do. There's a lot of waste. There's a lot of issues that we could actually do if we gave the governor the ability of management rights authority, if we did some of the consolidation things that the speaker just sits on, if we addressed, there's a lot of systemic issues. There's pension reform issues that would address things in an ongoing fashion that would really help to get the pension crisis back under control. The speaker has to be convinced that he's won, right? That he's kind of held somebody out there long enough, or he decides that he's going to retire and to go to Florida. And it was funny because I asked this individual, this businessman, I said, so what do you think Speaker Madigan is most afraid of? And he said, that's a really good question. He said, my guess is that he's most afraid of Palm Springs. He is most afraid of being in retirement and not having people say, Mr. Speaker, paying homage and what it is. There's a lot of things I think that's on the governor's agenda that would help in short order. The speaker has to decide to let go in that. Yes?
Holding people out there's 8,600 people a month exiting the state. It's the largest exit of any state in the history of the country. They keep going. We will not be able to tax ourselves out of it. So him holding people out there, the message you need to send back there is it's over. There's 400 people an hour turning 62, 10,000 people a day. They're leaving the state, but now the unions are leaving the state.
Yeah.
8,600 a month are leaving this state. There are houses empty. People have already moved. They can't sell the homes because of their property taxes. That's the message you need to send back. They can't tax themselves out with less people.
I agree. Yes.
You would say pension liability
Sorry.
is your greatest concern.
What's one of them?
Due to the fact that it's in our Constitution, and the Supreme Court of Illinois has already knocked down that one bill for pension reform. How are you going to change the Constitution to get to the reform of pension?
Well, there's a couple of steps. First would be changing pensions in a forthgoing basis, so that any new people that are being hired actually are not getting as the generous pension gifts. Now it doesn't apply so much, for example, with teachers, but it applies much more with some state employees and such. There has been a bill proposed in the House to actually have a constitutional convention to address this issue. Frankly, we've had a constitutional convention once about every 50 years, and we had a constitutional convention right about 50 years ago. So it would, now is the possibility. It's time that we could do something along that line. One of the things that we've done some things in regards to trying to give early buyouts for people in order to help lower the liability. So if you went at retirement, you can then choose to take an early buyout and just then get out of the system altogether, saving the state money, and you get a lump sum of a reduced amount that you would be able to then go and do whatever you want to with. So there's a lot of proposals on the table. One of them, and that's one of the reasons why we put on the budget, is actually like on K-12 education, is shifting the burden on the cost for pensions back to local school districts, at least in a foregoing basis. And there's an important reason for that. Right now, if your school district has the ability of doing an 8%, they have enough cash, they can do an 8% raise, then they can do an 8% raise. There's a pension cost associated with that. Your local school district doesn't pay it. The state pays it in a blank check. We have a blank check to every school district, every university. No matter what you pay your employees, we will pay the pension costs from the state. So there's no incentive at the local district level to contain costs. So there's things along that line that we might be able to do.
Massachusetts Bay Colony experiment where everybody takes McConchie.
Yes.
Well, I was going to ask you about that when I had my hand up earlier. So you're talking about taking at least part of the pension responsibility and shifting it back to the school districts, which means our property taxes.
No, because, so this is what happens. So we would, what we did in our plan was we actually capped spending at the state level about $32.7 billion. We put teeth in that cap by saying that anytime the state overspent the cap, that the legislators overspent the cap, we lost all salary, all per diems, and all reimbursements for the year. And then what we did was we said any money that comes in over the top, 25% of that would actually go into education through a new school funding formula in order to help facilitate the move away from property taxes toward better, more reliance, a balanced reliance on the state. Now, the other thing that this does is we were looking at it going forward, we were talking about the fact, I had a bill this year that I ran, couldn't even get a hearing on it, but well, actually we did get a hearing at one point, but what it would do is say, whatever the state is currently paying now for your school district, that's a fixed level. The state is not going to do more. So as the local school district raises salaries in the future, they have to factor in the pension costs as a part of the rate. So if you could afford 8%, you would give 8%, you would give 5%, and the 3% would go toward those pension costs. That's
You also said earlier, including for, going forward, I've seen proposals come out of the Republican side of the House where they would take part of the existing debt and shift it back to us too.
Yeah, we did not do that in our plan. What I'll tell you is that the last time that there was a full cost shift that was proposed in the legislature, the Democrats proposed moving it entirely back onto local school districts, and they did it over a 12-year period. Actually, it was Republicans who killed that bill because they said we didn't have a system through which addressing the rise in property taxes.
Totally disagree with you. It wasn't the Republicans that killed it.
You there?
Totally disagree.
Yes.
Yeah, what you're saying there. I'm from Crystal Lake, District 47 is similar to Cary. All
Mhm.
Power counties are the same one. And what we do need is the state to live up its constitutional law to be the major funder of education. District 47 in Crystal Lake, they spent almost $70 million last year. Half of it should have came from the state. That's $35 million. The state only gave us $9 million. If we'd gotten $26 million, we would have been able to reduce the school portion of our property taxes by almost 35%.
I agree.
And shifting
But
pension costs is
what
going to
does
add
it matter
to
if it
what
comes
we
from the
don't get.
state or local, it still comes out of our pocket,
Yeah.
taxes are taxes.
Young man, yes.
So I'm actually, I was the student trustee at Harper College
Mhm.
from Cary, and I had been there for about 3 years. On the university side of this, the community college side, what I saw was as the budget stalemate dragged on, there was more and more pressure on the university to be more stringent, to possibly pause any initiatives that it had, freeze hiring, create vacancies and positions, and then actually, as years went on, 2 of my bosses were let go in layoffs. Students have not received MAP grants from the state, so our university had to take money out of its own bottom line to cover that. So there were a lot of things that weren't being lived up on the state's level, which is a matter of not only borrowing money to have to spend it and then having to pay for that, but other mismanagement. One of the things I wanted to talk about, going back to higher education later, was criminal justice reform as ways to drive down recidivism to reduce costs in the state. Are there any plans in the myriad of the other things that you're working on, Democratic, Republican, Senate, or House side, that focus on criminal justice reform and bringing down the state's costs while upping the quality of education?
So in regards to criminal justice reform, actually, this is one of the things I really do applaud the governor on. Our numbers of people in prison are dramatically lower than they were even 2 years ago. The governor and his team, he brought in a new director of prisons, whom I met, a great guy out of retirement in Iowa, who is a mental health specialist. And so what they did was they systematically started going through the cases in there in order to be able to get the mental health help that many of our prisons have largely become mental health institutions, right? And so to be able to provide the help and support that they need. I can't give you numbers off the top of my head, so I won't try, but I know the numbers are down dramatically. And then we've passed some legislation, I voted for legislation this year, in which we took the inner city gun problem, and we have a really big violence issue, obviously, in the city of Chicago. What we did was we actually increased penalties for repeated gun use, which is something that Cook County has been desperately asking for, because what would happen is they'd arrest somebody on a gun charge, and the state laws were so weak in regards to holding them, is a very short period of time, they'd just be back out on the street and causing more violence and mayhem. We upped those penalties, but at the same time, we reduced other penalties. Some things had to do with drug use and things like that, and addressing some of those mental health issues. So we're making progress in that regard. I still think we have a ways to go, but this is something where there will be a kind of a bottom, right, which we probably can't get below a certain number of people that are going to be in prisons, just given society and where we are today. We're not quite there yet, but we are continuing to make progress in that regard.
To follow up, how is the financial strain on some of the services and institutions that have been affected by budgeting has affected the success of some of those procedures or initiatives?
Well, I don't know that we have any data that explains kind of direct correlation, but certainly there is some of that because, there are many things in the state budget that are under court order, that money keeps going out the door, right, despite the fact that we don't have a budget. Medicaid is supposed to go out the door even though we're so far behind in paying your bills. Social service agencies are not in that list. And so we've had a number of places that have simply closed up shop, been unable to survive. And it has been that is probably, I think, the biggest catastrophe from the existing budget impasse that we've had. And this is something that, we will be paying for this for some time to come. Yes.
As a Democrat, I thank you for working bipartisan. I
Mhm.
appreciate it. I'm stuck with this too, so thank you. But what are we doing? Are you considering new revenue sources? I know there's a push for online gambling to be legalized, also recreational marijuana. And then a follow-up to that would be when you talk about undue influence of money, unions, that sort of thing. Are you open to public campaign financing? Because I know the next election cycle with the governor's race, it's going to break records. That might be better spent elsewhere, right?
Well, I don't agree that we should take taxpayer dollars and use them in campaigns. We right now are spending $6 billion more than we have coming in. The idea that we would continue to put off social service agencies and very, really critical infrastructure needs that we have in order to pay for people's TV ads and mail is something that I've not met. It just does not, the public is not there for that. Your other question was in regards to the
New sources of revenue.
new sources of revenue. There has been talk of expanding gambling. So I told you about the gaming bill. They wanted to add 5 new casinos to the state. Recreational marijuana has been one of the items that has been put forward. Let me just tell you the story of Colorado in regards to marijuana. So this was legalized through a constitutional amendment. They came up with a very robust process in order to try to keep the purity of the product from getting out of control. They would, if something ever went wrong, they would know, they'd be able to go all the way back to who grew it, packaged it, and be able to identify what the problem is. What we were told in committee was that the overhead for that was so expensive that despite the fact that Colorado has really become a tourist destination for marijuana usage, there are people who travel there, get high, and then come back home, that they are only clearing $200 million a year. So if you're looking at least in the Colorado example, they're saying, look, we're trying to do the management of it right, and this is all that we're clearing. And that doesn't count for any potential increases in kind of the social service, burdens on social service sector or things like that may come from increased drug usage. And I just simply don't favor online gambling. I don't favor that in general. Yes.
I think in my opinion, we gotta learn how to grade the stump down in Springfield. The thing is, we ain't gonna be able to do that until we get rid of a certain person down there, and that's manning it. And that's probably one of the hardest things to do because he's got more control than the government, and the governor, and everybody else in the state of Illinois as far as controlling sees what goes on.
Well, what I would tell you is if you care about having a Springfield that is responsive to you, the number one thing that you should be promoting is fair maps. And so if you looked at the maps that are drawn in our state legislative districts, they make like no sense at all, right? I mean, they go for, through the city of Chicago, you can be downtown Chicago and then all the way out in the suburbs and a little thin. But wait, actually, it makes perfect sense. What they do is they craft them in such a way as to put like as many Republicans as possible in one district and then spread the Democrats out into other districts so they elect more Democrats. Let me give you some numbers. So the Senate is supermajority controlled by the Democratic Party. The House is within, I think, 3 seats Democrats are within 3 seats of supermajority control out of the 118 members. The voting difference between the parties in the state for state legislative races, if you just look the way people vote across the state, there's only a 4.6% difference between the parties. And yet, Madigan has supermajority control down there, right? And that is because of the way these maps are drawn. I would much prefer, to have a district, so my district, if you look to the eastern part of my district, you'll see downtown Mundelein is cut out and given to someone else. Well, why is downtown Mundelein cut out? It's because it's a heavily Hispanic area. Now, it's funny because 2 of my brothers, who are both married to Hispanics, live in that little area that has been cut out. And I actually spoke to a Hispanic member of the Senate, he said, who went to Mundelein Seminary, which my line kind of goes through the backyard, and he said, well, you have Hispanics in your district? And I said, no, I don't. Because your party cut them out of my district in order to be able to do the gerrymandering that he did. And he just wagged his head and said, yeah, I know this is the type of game that continues. Any other questions in the back? Yes, ma'am.
What percentage and what is the percentage of the state budget for pensions? And wasn't the pensions for state workers funded up until 1995? And then all of a sudden it got unfunded?
I can't give you the exact percentage. I just don't have that. If you want, call my office. I'm happy to get that number for you. And yes, so this dates back to the early 90s. I can't give you the exact year, but this is actually a bipartisan problem. Because what happened was Governor Edgar, working with Speaker Madigan, created something called the Edgar Ramp. And what they started doing was dramatically underfunding pensions to be able to put money elsewhere. And they were supposed to increasingly then do that over time, ramp up their funding to where, like 80% of our budget in 2045 is supposed to be going into pension. Some astronomically, absolutely undoable number in 2045. And then it drops back down to like the normal, 15% or what it is. So this is something where both parties decided they were not going to do the hard work of fulfilling the promises that they were given, and as a result, stuck the rest of us with that bill. Yes, sir.
Senator, first of all, thanks for coming out.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
You showed up, a lot of people don't. Yeah. The second thing is, thank you. I understand that you're concerned about the CN Railroad crossing in Barrington, which all of us on the other side of the river hope we solve something. But the other thing, you gotta say thanks to Senator Redondo. He does a very brave thing that you all did with her, try and get a budget. People are talking about Speaker Madigan, but there was a program to try and get something with the governor that would have stopped the launch. I know it didn't all work out. My point is on school taxes, and yes, we should give more to the schools. I think we could get support for a tax increase on income tax. If you could work a mechanism where there's a similar reduction in property taxes, kind of a dollar for dollar, because in your example, the old lady in the 3-bedroom ranch, that's the wrong way to tax.
Yeah, right.
The income tax is so much better distributed amongst those who can pay, et cetera. If we shift that to income tax, I think we could have some support for it. And tax increase we could adopt.
So we call that a tax swap. Actually, a friend of mine in the House, State Representative Mark Batnick, has put a proposal on that on the table, which would actually, what it would do is cap how much could be taxed at I want to say it's 1.75% or something of that nature. And then anything that's above that would then be replaced by the state, and there would be then an increase in some other forms of taxation. I don't know that entirely would have to be in income tax. That is, let me just tell you that there's one big downside to that, and one that we need to wrestle with as a community. And that is the fact that we have been prorating schools for years because we haven't had enough money at the state. And if we do that, we are sending more money to Springfield to go through the hands of Mike Madigan and President Cullerton and whoever the governor is before it comes back, right? So there is a devil in the details here that we do have to be concerned about. And so that, I think we just need to be honest about that discussion. Yes, ma'am.
In that line with the property tax issue, I'm gonna sound like a horrible person
No.
saying that, but I wanna pay a higher property tax because I want my home to be higher value than others. I wanna live in a certain area that has good schools and good police and safe and everything. So what is that tax reform? What would that do? What would that look like?
So this is another issue that it gets to the complicating factor of all of this. So let's say, so where I live in Hawthorne Woods, and my kids go to Lake Zurich High School. Right through my backyard is the school line for Stevenson High School. Everybody's heard of Stevenson, right? The 5,000 student campus, and all these kids that go there go to Ivy League schools and one of the best schools in the state and whatever. If my house were on the other side of that line, my value of my house would be $100,000 more, and my corresponding tax bill would probably be at least $5,000 a year more. I pay about $10,000 a year now. It would probably be about $15,000. Now, you do have an issue of if you dramatically change the way in which you do this, you do have areas that have innate built property values that if you start consolidating school districts, like somebody mentioned, if you start changing the way some of the taxation structures, it's going to have an influence in property values. Okay, it just will. And how do you do that in a way that does not create casualties? It's going to be a difficult thing to do. Now, we've been over for about 20 minutes, but I assume we can take a couple more questions. And yeah, we keep going. Yes, sir.
Let's talk about the tax swap. Don Clark mentioned that plan in the 90s, and it was back when Lee Becker was office.
Yes.
Tax was 2.5, raised to 3.5. Taxes went up 40% for education, but the problem is that money went in the general revenue fund. Educational money needs to go in a separate fund where it doesn't get put into other areas.
No, I agree with that. The money would need to be segregated, just like we just did. I mean, how many people voted in the last election and you voted to segregate your road fund, right? You segregate your motor vehicle fuel tax and the money that you pay for your license plate to be put into the road fund so that it couldn't be swept, right? It couldn't be stolen for other purposes. And so now that's a part of the Constitution. We can't do that. We probably need something similar. But here's the thing, at the end of the day, we could segregate everything and then we have no flexibility whatsoever, right? But you're right, exactly, which is why I think we need fair maps. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
What do you find is the tipping point? We've sat here, we've listened to the story, everybody's final question is what is going to change? Even if everybody wants to blame Madigan, and let's say he is completely to blame. Now what?
So so some people have said, what's next, right? I paint a very dire picture. And part of the reason why I don't have lots of sunshine and roses to give to you is, because of the autocratic nature of the way the state is organized, and Madigan holds all the cards, and no one really quite knows what Madigan is going to do. The real inflection point that I think is coming is this summer, is whether schools are going to open this fall. So the way the schools opened the past 2 years, and there's a lot of schools in the state, some of our school districts, if the state didn't have a budget, could continue to open. A lot of them have rainy day funds, would be able to continue to operate. If we don't have an appropriation for schools, there will be some school districts that simply don't open. So 2 years ago, when this all first started, there was a budget that was passed by the legislature, sent to the governor. He line item vetoed the entire budget except for the education portion and allowed that to go into effect so that schools could open, okay? Last year was the stopgap budget that funded schools and road construction for the entire year. We are coming up to the point where the governor has said, I don't want a stopgap again, I want a real budget. And the speaker has said, I'm only going to send you a stopgap budget. And that's where they are at this point. But we're coming to a point in which schools are not going to open. And of all the places that this is most problematic, is inside the city of Chicago. Crime goes down. The number of dead in the streets go down when school goes back into session because the kids are not out in the streets during the day while the gangbangers are having at each other, right? And so this is going to be an issue. If CPS can't open, and yeah, I can promise you, the Sun-Times, the Chicago Tribune, WGN, all of them are going to go to the first kid, you know, the first tragedy situation, going to plaster this on TV by saying schools aren't open, that's the governor's fault, or it's the speaker's fault, or what is it? So that is what's the next inflection point that's really we're going to be seeing. Yes.
As a follow-up to that, I guess, is do you have the ability, because you told us what you can and can't do, to not do anything else except work on the budget? Like,
So-
don't do anything else that hits anybody else's desk until the budget's passed.
So, yes, so in order for that to work, we need, remember the numbers I told you at the beginning, 60, 30, and 1, okay? So I told you about a lot of the things that we cannot do. One of the things that's completely within my power to do is not vote. And in fact, State Representative Mark Batnick got so fed up, he's from Plainfield, good friend, he got so fed up that he said, I am not voting on anything except budget-related items. And so he just simply stopped voting on stuff. There's actually been discussion that a number of other members have said, why don't we do the same? The problem is that you have to get to 60 members of the House or 30 members of the Senate to be able to grind action to a halt. And then those people have to stick together. And frankly, it would have to be bipartisan. I mean, you're not going to be able to get, you're not just going to have Democrats throw the speaker under the bus or throw the president under the bus. It would have to be done on a bipartisan basis. I'm certainly willing to do that. So far, we've not seen enough people willing to kind of take that bold step that I think is necessary. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I'm a state employee, retired, and my medical bills are like 2 years behind.
Yes.
I've heard that they have to pay 9% interest on those. Is that correct?
Okay, so for these bills, they're on the chart here. A significant portion, probably about half of these, are subject to either what's called timely pay or prompt pay. And this was done, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago. And this is a state-mandated interest rate that is paid on overdue bills. Certain items, it's 9% or 0.75% per month. And on certain other items, it's 1% per month or 12% per year. Now, this was done because why? No one would be so stupid as to not pay our bills, right, and let them mount up and then pay this ungodly interest rate, right? When you could go to the market and bond out at 4.25%, perhaps even 3.75%, no one would be that stupid. Well, we've been that stupid now for 2 years. And so this is, they do get that kind of level of money. I've actually talked about reforming this, but because here's the thing, I think it could be 24% a year, it could be 36% a year, it wouldn't matter to the leadership that's there. So that's a reform that needs to take place, but only when we get the rest of our house in order. So that's 2 more questions. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think there's going to be another trial to get the gerrymandering thing organized for redistricting? I worked on 2 of those campaigns, and Madigan's Supreme Court threw out both of them.
So I know that there has been some talk. The problem is it's really expensive because you have to come up with like 600,000 signatures in order to turn it in. And the problem is, so for those of you that don't know, the last time that this was attempted to be put onto the ballot, Speaker Madigan challenged it in court. It went to the state Supreme Court, and it was a 4-3 ruling that tossed it off on a technicality that the person in the minority side who wrote the minority opinion said, this is just making up reasons out of thin air. I mean, this is the farthest thing from jurisprudence that you could possibly imagine. But let me tell you why, a connection to there. The head, well, it's not the head now, but the former head of the Supreme Court who was on that decision, on the majority decision, was someone who, last time he ran for office, got $1.5 million from Mike Madigan to run for that office, and, well, that chip got called, which is part of the reason why that got tossed down. So, but to answer your question, I'm not sure, because the question is whether there's enough kind of money and willingness to try that again. Last question. Yes, sir.
What about taxing pensions? That's been debated lately, hasn't it?
So we are one of 3 states that does not tax retirement at all. Of those states that have a income tax. So there has been some talk about taxing pensions. I have not heard this, lately in any way. The last I heard was that there was a suggestion that we tax pensions for those that are collecting them before 65. Okay, so if you retire early and start collecting a pension, that you would tax that pension up until age 65. That was the last suggestion I heard, and that was rejected during the budget negotiations. I mean, frankly, I don't know how much money you would get from taxing retirement in this state, just given how many people are already looking at moving. But certainly there is a question in regards to that. So thank you very much. For those of you that may have had a question that I did not get to answer, please come up afterward. I'd love to answer it. And so again, if you need something, this is my telephone, my number and address. We always we're here to serve you, and thank you for the opportunity of being your elected representative. Thank you very much.